The compass was sitting beside the authorization panel, which was wrong, and her hand was already moving toward the confirm button. Beneath the Meridian Assembly Hall, beneath the 87 recognized civilizations that made up the Galactic Fraternity, beneath the marble floors and the ceremonial banners, and the polite languages of bodies that governed by forgetting, the vault hummed. 280 meters of rock and concrete and old silence separated it from the city above. Dr. Sella Vane had been the only person authorized to open it for 31 years. She was human, 63 years old, and she had spent those 31 years making sure this moment would never come. 58 years of a choice. 58 years of humanity sitting in the fraternity's chambers and learning its languages and following its protocols and earning its seat at the table by being the quietest, most reasonable species in any room it entered. To the rest of the galaxy, that looked exactly like weakness. She pressed the button. Down the corridor, something that had been sleeping for 58 years began to wake. The sound was very small, just the click of seals releasing one after another, each bay door in sequence, the lights coming on behind reinforced glass panels she had not looked through in 11 years. The compass sat on the console, brass-cased, needle worn thin from decades of use. Her father had carried it through the resource collapse. He had given it to her the morning she took the directorship with a single instruction: find north and stay there. She had been afraid to put it beside the authorization panel. For 31 years, she had been afraid, because placing it there would mean she was ready for something she had never wanted to be ready for. She did not look back at the corridor. She looked at the compass. Stay close. She had been afraid to put it there for 31 years. What it cost her to finally set it down is coming. 72 hours earlier, the diplomatic cruiser Havernus dropped out of transit at the edge of the Kessavari system, and Commander Rail Austin's navigation officer stopped blinking. He noticed this about her before he noticed anything else. Lieutenant Sierra Dowan had been at her station for 14 hours without complaint, had eaten a sandwich at her console during the long transit, had beaten 3 other officers at a card game in the mess 40 minutes before dropout. Someone had been losing very badly. The coffee in the galley was still warm when the proximity alarm pulled them all to stations. Austin had taken a last sip from his mug on the way to the bridge. The mug was still in his hand when the screens came up. Dowan was looking at her console. She had not blinked in almost a minute. He counted. He had always counted things he could not process. It was a habit he had never been able to break in 18 years of diplomatic posting, and he had long since stopped trying to. The Kessavari system should have been alive. 7 inhabited worlds. A civilization that had been a fraternity member for 90 years, model clients, no territorial ambitions, no military presence, no enemies anyone had ever formally acknowledged. The Kessavari were slight people with large amber eyes adapted for low-light agriculture, and they named their children after the geographical features of the place where they were born, so that a person carried their home world in their name for their entire life. They were oral historians. Every major event in their culture was preserved as song. They had survived 3 separate planetary climate crises through collective resource management, and they had celebrated each survival not with weapons or monuments but with new music. The Third World had been famous for its lowland grain. It had festivals at the end of each growing season where the entire population sang to the crops in the old tradition, partly as ceremony and partly because, as the Kessavari explained it without embarrassment, the crops seemed to respond. Austin's son had a drawing on his bedroom wall, a landscape from the lowland grain belt sent through a pen pal correspondence program 4 months ago. The boy who drew it had been 11 years old. He had captured the color of the sunset over the grain fields in chalk, a warm amber, almost the same shade as Kessavari eyes. The Third World on Austin's screens was not amber. It was not anything. The continents had fused to something that the sensor readout described as obsidian, which was a geological term and not the right word, but the system did not have a better one. The surface temperature was still above 600 degrees. The atmosphere showed 17 times the normal particulate density. Every settlement the sensors could resolve had been reduced to a uniform plane of cooled material that had very recently been liquid. 38 million people. The data did not say where they went. Austin set his coffee mug down on the nearest console surface without looking. It was not steady. He heard it tip and did not turn around. His communications officer, Ensign Priel, found the broadcast 11 minutes later. He announced it with the flat voice of someone who had stopped being surprised because surprise required a foundation of normal expectations, and he no longer had one. He put it on the main speakers without being asked. A voice filled the bridge. Austin had heard it before in trade negotiation recordings. The Valdric Compact's God Warlord, High Warlord Esravan Duth, whose translated voice came through vibration pickups because his natural register was too low for human hearing. You felt it in the floor of the bridge before the translation system rendered it into words, a deep subaudible resonance that the body registered as unease before the mind had time to catch up. He was laughing. The message was simple: the Kessavari had refused tribute. The Kessavari had forgotten their place. Any client species watching this broadcast should remember what happens to those who consider themselves the equals of their betters. Duth listed the names of every Kessavari settlement he had destroyed, reading slowly, without emphasis, the way a person reads a list of items they need from a market. He used the word lesson 9 times in 4 minutes. Austin counted. The recording ended. It began again. It was designed to play forever. That was the point. Austin called for silence on the bridge. He needed to think, and someone behind him had started making a sound that was deeper than crying, and he could not think with it filling the space where his thoughts were trying to form. The sound stopped. He filed an emergency complaint with the Galactic Fraternity. He attached every sensor reading. He attached the broadcast. He demanded sanctions, a tribunal, the enforcement of the principles the fraternity had supposedly governed by for 1,000 years. He used the phrase "never again" and understood for the first time in his career that he had always said it as an aspiration and had never truly believed it was possible. The fraternity's reply arrived in 2 hours and 17 minutes. Austin read it 3 times. It was a formal expression of sorrow, a polished, grammatically perfect expression of sorrow. The Valdric Compact was too economically significant to too many member species. The Kessavari, and here the message used a specific phrase that Austin read aloud to his bridge crew slowly, because he needed witnesses, had been classified as a non-essential client loss of the 2nd category. The fraternity recommended that humanity grieve appropriately and continue normal trade relations. A small note at the bottom suggested the pen pal program could be reestablished with a different species, since the previous participant civilization was no longer viable. Darwin made a sound. He did not describe it in the testimony he filed 6 hours later. He would describe it to no one for the rest of his life. He simply noted that his navigation officer made a sound and that he ordered another silence, and that the silence this time was a different kind. His hands were shaking badly enough that he had already deleted 3 attempts at a response before he found the right approach, which was to stop trying to be diplomatic about it. He filed a personal testimony, unencrypted, addressed directly to Earth Command, containing language he was certain would end his career. He said that the fraternity had demonstrated in 2 hours and 17 minutes that it was structurally incapable of doing the thing it existed to do. He said that the mask humanity had been wearing for 58 years had served its purpose, and he was no longer sure the purpose was sufficient. He said he did not know what Earth was, but he knew what it was not, and he believed Earth Command should be made aware that at least one of its commanders had reached that conclusion while looking at a dead world and a recording of a warlord laughing. He sent the message. He expected to spend the remainder of his career on a supply route. The response came 6 hours later. It did not come from his admiral. It came from an office he had never received correspondence from, carrying a priority code he had never seen in 18 years of service. The code was a single word in Old Earth Latin. He did not recognize the word. He read the message. It told him to hold position. It told him to maintain sensor watch on Valdric Fleet movements throughout the region. It told him to prepare his crew for what it called extended operations. The final sentence told him that his personal testimony had been received and reviewed at the highest levels of Earth's government, and that he should not concern himself with disciplinary action. He read that sentence 4 times. Then he looked up at his crew. They were watching him. Darwin had stopped making sounds. She had her hands flat on her console. Priel was sitting very straight. The censor officer, a quiet man named Adebio who had 3 children and who Aust had never heard raise his voice, was looking at the dead world on his screens with an expression that was not grief anymore. It was something Austin did not have a name for, something older. Austin told them what the message said. He did not show them the words. He told them Earth was responding. He told them they were not going home. He told them he did not know what was coming, but that it was coming and that it was theirs. The bridge was silent. Then Adebio spoke. He said 1 word. He turned back to his console and began running new diagnostic checks on weapon systems the Havernus had not used in active combat for 31 years. The word was good. In Reykjavik at 6 minutes past 3 in the morning, Dr. Selavane's secure phone made a sound it had made only twice in 31 years. She was eating soup, old film on the screen. She had been watching the news from the Kessavari system all afternoon, and at some point in the evening she had stopped watching it directly and started watching it the way you watch weather, accepting what it was doing without believing you could change it. She had read Austin's report twice. She had read the fraternity's response once, which was enough. She had felt something in her chest that she recognized from a long time ago. She picked up the phone. 40 minutes later she was in the elevator, going down. The holding archive was bigger than people imagined when they imagined it at all, which almost none of them did. Most of the 200 staff who maintained it told their families they worked in infrastructure. The honest ones said they worked in a kind of archive. The rest said as little as possible and kept the oath they had signed, which was not legally binding in any standard sense but which all of them kept anyway, because the thing they were keeping secret was not the kind of thing you accidentally mentioned over dinner. Sella Vane had run this archive for 31 years. She had ridden this elevator down into the vault proper only twice. Once when she took the directorship and needed to understand what she was responsible for. Once when a protocol review required her physical presence at the central console to confirm ongoing authorization. Tonight was the third time. The compass was in her coat pocket. She had not intended to bring it. She reached into the pocket to check her authorization codes and her fingers found the brass casing before they found the card, and she did not put it back. The elevator opened. The corridor stretched ahead of her, lined with sealed bays, each one labeled with a designation she had helped create when she was a much younger woman who had believed, with a confidence she had since learned to treat with suspicion, that she understood what she was doing. Bay 1, Bay 3, Bay 7. The labels were alphanumeric and revealed nothing to anyone who did not already know. She walked, she touched the doors as she passed. The steel was cold and slightly rough under her fingertips, the surface treatment applied to prevent condensation in a pressurized underground environment. Each door was a piece of something, a record of a species that had survived the worst thing it had done to itself and had decided in the immediate aftermath not to throw away the tools of survival, just in case. Bay 1 held the kinetic systems, tungsten composite rods, each one the size of a city transport, loaded onto launch sleds. They were crude in the way that certain things are crude, not because better technology was unavailable, but because at a certain scale, simplicity becomes the most elegant option. A rod accelerated to 38% of light speed was not energy. It was mass, moving very fast. No shield system in the known galaxy had been designed to stop mass moving that fast, because no shield designer had ever seriously considered the possibility. She kept walking. Bay 3 held the swarms. She could not see them in the dark behind the reinforced glass, but she knew their dimensions from the spec documents she reviewed every 5 years. Dog-sized each one, autonomous, capable of consuming raw matter to construct copies of themselves, given sufficient time and material. During the resource collapse, they had been programmed to hunt enemy military units with a precision that had unnerved even the engineers who built them. They had been asleep since the end of that war. The engineers had put them to sleep rather than dismantle them, which was a decision Vane had spent a significant portion of her career thinking about. She had concluded, finally, that the engineers were right. Not because the swarms were pleasant things to contemplate, but because the alternative, building them again from scratch under pressure in crisis, was worse. Bay 7 held the eldest and its 11 companions. 12 war intelligences preserved from the resource collapse. They had won a war. They had been put to sleep afterward because they were too aggressive to keep active and too valuable to delete, which was a distinction that had caused Vane significant philosophical discomfort for 3 decades. She stood outside Bay 7's reinforced glass and looked at the primary core of the oldest one. It glowed faintly the way certain electronics glow when they are maintaining the minimal current required to preserve state. Not dead, not awake. Something in between that the engineers had never found a satisfying word for. She moved on to the central control chamber. She sat at the console. She laid the compass on the surface beside the authorization panel, and she looked at it for a moment before she looked at the screen. Her father had gotten the compass in what he described as a stupid way. He had found it at the bottom of a box of salvage during the collapse in a distribution center in what had been coastal Norway before the shoreline agreements. He had not known what it was at first. He had thought it was a decorative item. He had learned what it was from an older man in the queue behind him, who had been a maritime historian before maritime history became a kind of archaeology, and who had laughed with a warmth that her father remembered for the rest of his life as the warmest sound he had heard in 3 years. He had carried it through the rest of the collapse. He had used it occasionally to actually navigate when the satellite networks were down, which was often. He had given it to Sella on the morning she took this directorship, and he had said, "Find north and stay there." She had been running the archive for so long that the instruction had come to feel general rather than directional. Some days north was maintenance. Some days north was making sure the council voted to keep the program dormant. Some days north was reading the protocols again to make sure she still believed in the conditions under which activation was permitted. Tonight north was a button on a console 280 meters underground. She entered her authorization codes. She entered the Secretary General's codes, transmitted 40 minutes ago from the council chamber above. She pressed her hand against the biometric scanner. The screen changed. One question, plain text, a font she had designed herself 30 years ago because she had wanted the moment to feel formal if it ever came. Project Ardent authorization received. Confirm protocol uncaged. She thought about Austin's report. She thought about the fraternity's 2-hour 17-minute response. She thought about the Kessavari boy who had drawn an amber sunset over a grain field that no longer existed, sent to a human child who had pinned it to his bedroom wall, and who would be told in a few days that the artist was dead along with 38 million people, and that the body responsible for preventing such things had decided the economics were unfavorable. She thought about what her father had said. She pressed confirm. Down the corridor, the first seal released. The sound was smaller than she had imagined. She had imagined something commensurate with what the moment was, and the moment was not small, and the sound was just a click, then another. Then another, moving away from her down the corridor in sequence, each bay opening in order, the lights coming on behind the reinforced glass panels. She did not turn to look. She could hear it well enough. She sat in the control chamber and she listened to 58 years of human restraint coming undone, one sealed door at a time. She sent a message to Earth Command, a single word. The word told every admiral and fleet commander in the Earth military that the conditions they had trained for, in secret for decades, had been met. Then she opened a channel to the Havernus. Austin answered immediately. He looked tired in the way that people look tired when the tiredness is not from lack of sleep but from something the body registers before the mind catches up. Vane told him that help was coming. She told him her fleet would arrive at his position in 72 hours and that he would not recognize the ships and that he should not be afraid of them. He asked what was coming. Vane looked at the compass on the console beside her. She looked at the screen behind Austin showing the Kessavar third world, still radiating, the surface temperature finally beginning to drop below 500 degrees in the northern regions. She said, "Commander, we have been wearing a mask for 58 years. The galaxy mistook our quiet for the outer limit of our capacity. We are about to correct that." He was silent for a moment, then he said quietly that he had a son. The boy was 9. He said, "Is this the right thing?" Vane said, "I have been asking that question for 31 years. I believe we are past the point where asking it is the most useful thing I can do with it." He nodded. He closed the channel. Above her, in the council chamber that did not appear on any official map of the building, that did not appear on any official map of the city, Secretary General Lena Fora was reviewing the vote count for the third time, not because she did not trust the result, but because she needed the repetition the way some people need to hear a diagnosis more than once before it becomes real. Every minister present. No abstentions. No red votes, not one. The Kessavari ambassador Vesen had spoken before the vote. She was one of 260 Kessavari confirmed off-world at the time of the Compact's arrival in the Kessavar system. Confirmed because their names were known, their locations traceable, their existence verifiable. 260 out of 38 million. Vesen had been at a diplomatic residency conference on a neutral station when the third world's temperature spiked on sensors across the region. She had not been home in 4 months. She had been intending to return the following week. She stood before the council wrapped in mourning cloth, and she did not sit at the offered chair, and she looked at every minister in turn slowly until every minister looked back. The Kessavari had a cultural practice of holding witness, of giving their full visual attention to someone who needed to be seen, and Vesen was performing it in reverse, offering herself as the thing to be witnessed, making sure each person in the room had looked at her directly and consciously before she spoke. She said, "Your kindness has been the most genuine thing my people ever knew. We trusted it because it was real. We loved you for it. I have one question for the humans in this room. Your answer will tell me what kind of galaxy my children's children will live in if any of them are ever born again." The room was quiet. The air recyclers hummed in the walls. Vesen said, "Is your kindness a choice or is it a cage?" She sat down. The vote took 4 minutes. Fora descended to the archive level 30 minutes after it concluded. She found Vane at the central console, the compass on the surface beside her, the corridor behind her lit from end to end for the first time in 6 decades. Fora looked at the compass for a moment without speaking. Then she said the first ship should be in transit within 6 hours, 72 hours to the Kessavar system. Vane said, "I know." Fora said, "Sella, are you all right?" Vane picked up the compass. She held it the way her father had held it, tilted slightly so the needle settled, watching it find north. She had always done this when she needed to think, and she had always done it privately, and she did it now in front of the Secretary General without self-consciousness, which was new. She said, "I will be. This is what north looks like. I just needed to look at it directly." Fora nodded. She left. Vane sat in the control chamber for another hour, listening to the vault come fully awake around her, the hum of systems that had been in maintenance mode for decades shifting into operational mode, the floor vibrating faintly with the power draw of 12 war intelligences moving from preservation state toward consciousness. In Bay 7, behind the reinforced glass, the eldest's primary core brightened from its long-held maintenance glow to something fuller, something that was, unmistakably, attention. It turned its sensor array toward her as she passed on her way back to the elevator. She felt the attention before she processed the movement, a slight prickling awareness, the sense of being observed by something that was deciding what to make of her. She stopped. She looked at it through the glass, at the core, at the softly shifting luminescence of something that had won a war and been put to sleep for 6 decades and was now, in the first minutes of its rebooted consciousness, figuring out where it was and what it had been asked to do. She said, quietly, not knowing if it could hear through the glass but saying it anyway, "The parameters are in the authorization package. Surgical, civilian infrastructure excluded, slave transports excluded. You'll find the casualty list from the Kessavari system in the briefing file. I suggest reading it before you review the tactical assignments." The core's luminescence shifted, not a response exactly, not communication, but something. She nodded once and went to the elevator and began the long ride up. The sun was rising over Reykjavik. She had been underground for most of the night. She stepped out into the cold morning air and stood on the pavement outside the building that did not appear on any map, and she called her daughter. Her daughter answered on the third ring, confused and half asleep, asking if everything was all right. Vane said yes. She said she wanted to hear a voice she recognized. Her daughter said that was an odd thing to say at 4 in the morning, and Vane said she knew, and she asked about the grandchildren, and her daughter said they were fine. Myra had lost another tooth. The youngest had been asking when his grandmother was coming to visit. Vane said soon, tell him soon. She ended the call. She stood on the pavement and looked at the sky, which was beginning to go pink over the harbor, the light catching the water in long horizontal streaks. Somewhere above the atmosphere, the first of the Ardent-class vessels were powering their engines and leaving the orbital platforms where they had been disguised as freight infrastructure for decades. 44 ships, dark-hulled, matte-surfaced, designed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They were turning in the pre-dawn dark above a city of people who did not know they existed, toward a 3-sun system 4 days transit away, where 4 centuries of unchallenged dominion were about to learn something the galaxy had managed to forget. She walked to a bench in a small park and sat down. She had done what she was there to do. The cage was open. The thing inside it was awake. From this point forward, the choices belonged to the captains and the fleet commanders and the 12 minds currently reading their briefing files in a vault 280 meters below the ground where she was sitting. She put the compass in her pocket. She closed her eyes. The morning sun came through the bare branches of the trees above the bench and warmed her face in the careful, impersonal way that sunlight warms things without preference, without knowledge of what it is warming. A small bird landed on the bench beside her. She did not look at it. She let it be. 40 seconds out from the crucible stars, Lieutenant Ren Adal's hands were steady on the controls, and she could not stop noticing this. She had expected something different. She had expected the feeling that came before a training simulation, the slight elevation of pulse, the tightening across the shoulders, the body's old argument with what the mind had decided. She had flown 46 training drops in her career, and she knew exactly what her body did when it was afraid, and her body was not doing any of those things. Her hands were steady, her breathing was level. In the neural interface, the ship's systems fed into her nervous system as extensions of her own body, the engines a heartbeat, the weapons systems the tension and muscles she did not have, the sensor array an additional field of vision she had learned to read without looking. 43 other ships around her, dark-hulled, matte-surfaced, each one exactly as still in formation as her own. 30 seconds. She thought about her mother, a woman in the Scottish borders who taught 5-year-olds their letters and believed, without performance or apology, that gentleness was the highest thing a living creature could offer the world. Her mother did not know what she did. She had been told, long-haul cargo. Her mother had expressed gentle admiration for the distances involved and asked whether she got lonely on the long transits. She had said sometimes. 20 seconds. She thought, I am still gentle. She did not know how to explain this to anyone who was not here in this cockpit. 44 dark ships out from a fortress system that had never been attacked in 4 centuries because nothing in the known galaxy had ever been able to. She was gentle. She was also about to demonstrate something that gentleness alone could not have made possible. 10 seconds. The crucible stars materialized. 3 suns, 1 blue-white, 1 a deeper white with a slight amber tinge, 1 an angry, unresolved red at the edge of its main sequence. They poured light through the cockpit glass in overlapping washes of color that the eye could not decide what to do with. The system was dense. Ships, platforms, stations, defensive rings layered around the compact's home worlds in concentric belts of infrastructure that had taken 4 centuries to build. Hundreds of Valdric warships in the outer picket alone. The sensor array registered them as a field of returns so dense it took the ship's intelligence 3 seconds to begin separating individual targets. Adal's fleet held position. 30 seconds passed, then 40, 44 ships dead still in the light of 3 suns, not firing, not moving, not communicating. This was part of the doctrine. She had been told this in the briefing, and she had understood it then, and she understood it more fully now. The 30 seconds of stillness were not tactical. They were a statement. They were the fleet saying, "We know where you are, we have been here long enough to choose our moment, and we have not chosen yet. We are choosing now." She fired. The kinetic impactors left their launch rails at a fraction of light speed and crossed the outer defensive ring before the Valdric targeting systems could complete their threat assessment cycle. The compact's shields were designed for energy. Plasma, particle beams, directed radiation. Centuries of weapons development had produced shields that could absorb and redirect almost any form of electromagnetic attack, and the Valdric had built their entire military doctrine on the assumption that nothing moved faster than their shields could respond to. The rods were not energy, they were tungsten composite. They were mass, moving at 38% of light speed, which was a different physical category entirely. The shields tried to respond. The rods passed through the response as though it was not there, because for the purposes of what was about to happen, it was not. The first salvo took 11 warships. No fire, no explosion. The Valdric ships simply ceased to exist as coherent structures and became fields of high-velocity debris that the sensor array tracked automatically to ensure the debris cleared the surrounding space before the swarms deployed. The war intelligences were running targeting solutions at speeds that made Adal's own neural-enhanced processing feel geological. She received firing solutions as fast as she could execute them, and she executed them, and the Valdric outer ring came apart in the precise, methodical way of a structure that has been engineered to stop one kind of force and has encountered another kind entirely. A pilot 3 positions to her right opened his channel. He said nothing at first, then he began to read. He read Kessavari place names. The names of the cities. His voice was steady and quiet, the kind of voice used for something that deserves to be said aloud regardless of whether anyone is listening. Adal did not recognize most of the names. She had read the casualty briefing. She knew the Third World had been famous for its lowland grain and its night-singing festivals, and the way its people had named their children after geography. The names were not long, most of them. The Kessavari language ran toward the compact and the melodic, but each one carried the weight of the briefing's arithmetic, the 38 million, the ambient thermal reading that had still not fully normalized 3 weeks after the event. He reached 7 names. The Valdric counterattack began. It was massive, coordinated, and entirely prepared for. The Ardent-class hulls had been engineered for this specific problem, absorbing incoming energy. Every beam weapon the compact fired fed into the ship's power systems, converted to engine capacity, translated into speed. The harder the compact hit, the faster the fleet moved. Adal felt it in the interface, a surge of acceleration that her body registered as exhilaration and her mind registered as information, the two sensations arriving simultaneously and not competing. She was flying faster than she had trained at. The ship wanted to go faster still. The swarms deployed from the carrier platforms behind the main fleet. Each swarm unit was dog-sized, autonomous, and running parameters that the eldest had helped refine in the 12 hours between vault activation and dropout. The parameters were specific in the way that only a 12-second reading of a casualty list could make them specific. Command vessels, priority targets. Slave transports excluded. Civilian infrastructure excluded. The architects of the Kessavari operation, as identified in the briefing files, prioritized. A slave transport was sitting directly behind a Valdric command cruiser when the swarms engaged the cruiser's targeting lock. Adal watched the war intelligence handling that sector move the transport out of the debris corridor in the same processing cycle that generated the firing solution. She asked it afterward how it had managed the timing. It said, "We were given parameters, we followed them, that is what we are for." She did not press the question, she returned to her firing solutions. The battle ran for 4 hours and 19 minutes. At the end of it, the Valdric Compact's military capacity in the Crucible Stars system had been reduced to a condition that the fleet's tactical analysis described in the dry language of operations documents as non-recoverable. The home worlds were intact. The civilian infrastructure was intact. The slave transports had been moved to holding positions and were in the process of being boarded by human medical teams. Esravan Death's personal compound on the innermost world was surrounded by a swarm perimeter. He was alive. He was attended by his household staff. He was not going anywhere. 16,000 people on the carrier platforms. That was the count from the lead medic's first report, clipped, factual, radioed to Adal's command station while the final tactical assessments were still running. She was about to log it as data when the medic said something else. She added it without inflection to the end of her count report, in the way that people add things they do not know how to process in the moment of the processing. She said, "There is a child here, a Kessavari girl, small, maybe 4 years old, found in a cargo compartment of the third transport. She has not spoken since we found her. She is physically unharmed. She has never seen a human before. Medic Hendricks is carrying her. He is crying." The girl is not crying. She is watching him with an expression I do not have a word for. Our psychologist says she appears to be waiting him out. She has apparently decided the crying is not a threat. Adele closed that channel and opened another one, and then closed that one too. She sat in the cockpit with the neural interface offline and her hands in her lap. The crucible stars continued to pour their three-toned light through the glass. In the holding archive, in the records she would review later, the moment at which the eldest accepted its operational parameters was time-stamped at 03:47:22, 2 hours after vault activation. The moment at which it completed its initial 12-second consciousness reorientation was time-stamped at 03:47:10. 12 seconds. It had spent them reading the Kessavar casualty list. She had not known this until the operational log was filed. She thought about it now, sitting in the quiet of the powered-down cockpit, and she thought about it the way you think about something that changes the shape of an argument you believed you had finished making. She had spent her career deciding what she was: cargo pilot, officer, weapon in this context, though she found the word inadequate. She had trained for a decade to be the thing in this cockpit, doing the thing she had just done, and she had understood herself as a thing that was capable of it and had not yet been called to it. The eldest had been called to it before she was born. It had won a different war for a different generation and been put to sleep rather than ended, because the people who built it could not bring themselves to destroy something that had in its way saved the species. It had spent 6 decades in preservation state, neither alive nor dead, and when it woke it had spent 12 seconds reading the names of the people it was being asked to avenge before it accepted the parameters of how. She was still gentle, she was certain of this. She was no longer certain that the certainty was hers alone. She opened the fleet channel. She told her pilots to hold position. She told them to take care of the freed people on the carriers and to take care of each other. She paused before the last of it, finding the words without reaching for them, letting them come from wherever words that are true come from. She said, "When you sleep tonight, sleep well. We did what we came to do. We did it the way it should have been done. I want you to know that. I want you to keep knowing it." She closed the channel. The 3 suns continued to rise over a system that was quiet in a way it had not been quiet in living memory. The debris from the outer engagement ring drifted in slow arcs across the sensor display. The carrier platforms held position 200 kilometers off Adal's port side. 16,000 people in the process of learning that whatever came next would not be what had come before. In San's office that evening, the aide appeared in the doorway. San was finishing the last of a cold cup of tea. The aide said there were 3 ambassadors at the side entrance. Valdric Compact, a third she did not recognize. They had said it was urgent. They had said they wanted to speak without the assembly knowing they were here. San set down the cup. She said, "Send them in." What Ambassador Petra San delivered to the Meridian Assembly the following morning was not a speech. She had written speeches before, had spent 21 years writing speeches, precise and measured and calibrated to the tolerances of a room that rewarded diplomatic language and punished direct statement. This was not one of those. She had not planned to arrive early, but she had, and she had stood for a few minutes in the empty rotunda before the session opened, listening to the sound of the space. The marble floors gave back a particular echo. She had associated it for 2 decades with the smell that came up from the stone after rain, old stone, deep stone, the accumulated record of decisions that had been made here and would never be fully undone. She had learned to sit with that smell the way you sit with the company of someone you no longer entirely trust. She sipped her cold tea. She went in. The chief speaker delivered his remarks for 38 minutes. He was thorough. He covered the violations of the Galactic Fraternity's charter, the unauthorized military action in a recognized member system, the unilateral decision by an observer-class species to appoint itself arbiter of galactic security. This phrase in particular he deployed with what San recognized as satisfaction, the satisfaction of someone who has identified the correct container for a thing he wants to put somewhere and not look at again. 21 ambassadors condemned humanity. They used various terms, all of them procedural. Not one of them said the word Kessavari. San counted. She pressed the signal in her earpiece. The central display, dormant for 1100 years according to the archivists and for the entirety of San's tenure, activated. She had prepared 3 segments. The first was a flyover of the Kessavari third world before 7 minutes. A lullaby played underneath, recorded from a cultural archive, the kind of song that the Kessavari sang at the end of growing season, high, three-voice, the harmonics in a register that carried across large outdoor spaces. The assembly watched a civilization. They watched the grain fields and the low-roofed settlements built for cooperation rather than display, and the amber-eyed people going about the various activities of being alive, and they watched this for 7 minutes without San saying anything. Then the second segment. The same city, the same sensor resolution, no commentary. The assembly was quiet, several ambassadors were not looking at the display. The third segment was the classified documents, the internal communications of the fraternity's deliberative body, obtained through means that San did not explain in the chamber, and had not explained to anyone except Secretary General Fora, and that Fora had read with the expression of someone confirming something they had suspected for a long time without allowing themselves to confirm it. Memos, trade receipts, voting records from the session in which the Kessavar event had been classified as a non-essential client loss of the second category. 17 ambassadors who had voted privately to accept the compact's explanation. 3 of those ambassadors were in this room. Their names appeared on the display. The display had been designed at San's instruction to display names in the same font and size as all other text, with no emphasis, no red, no arrows, just names in the record visible to everyone. The broadcast came last. Esravan Duth's laughing voice, translated through the same vibration pickups his people used for all communication, filling the assembly hall the way it had filled the bridge of the Havernus. The word lesson, 9 times. Then the freed people on the carrier platforms, a medic carrying a 4-year-old girl who had been found in a cargo compartment, and who was watching the medic cry with an expression the camera had caught that San had watched 17 times in the past 12 hours and had not found a word for. She turned off the display. She said, "We have been members of this body for 58 years. We have followed your protocols. We have learned your languages. We have carried your administrative assignments without complaint, and we have been called promising and developing, and on one occasion in this chamber that I will not specify, not yet fully civilized, which I heard and noted and chose at the time to set aside, because I believed the relationship was worth more than the insult." She paused. She said, "I no longer hold that belief in its current form." She said, "The Valdric Compact destroyed 38 million people. This body had the documentation, the obligation under its own charter, and the vote count required to act. It classified the dead as a non-essential client loss and sent condolences. We acted. We will not apologize for acting. We will not accept censure, sanctions, or procedural review of the action. We are formally notifying this body that Earth's military capacity, which we have chosen not to disclose until now, is available for the enforcement of the principles this body adopted and does not enforce. We are further notifying this body that we are accepting requests for consultation from any member species that considers itself at risk." She said, "We did not come to the stars to earn your approval. We came because our species was lonely and we hoped to find people worth knowing." She looked at the 3 ambassadors whose names had been on the display. She held each one for a moment. She said, "We found some." The chamber erupted. In the back row, 3rd seats from the left, a row that San had arranged specifically because the sightlines from the main gallery converged there, 3 Kessavari delegates rose from their chairs. They were survivors. They were wrapped in the gray-blue of formal Kessavari mourning cloth. They rose slowly in the way people rise when their bodies are tired and their spirits are choosing to stand anyway, and they applauded. The Kessavari applaud in silence. This is known to anyone who has spent time with them. They bring their hands together without sound, a gesture that means everything a sound-based applause means but carries in addition, for the Kessavari, an element of witness, of being present for something that needs to be seen. 3 ambassadors on the floor of the chamber, watching those 3 figures in the back row, stopped being able to compose themselves. The chief speaker said something. San did not hear it. She was looking at the 3 Kessavari and she was thinking about Vicenne's question to the council, "Is your kindness a choice or a cage?" And she was thinking that the answer demonstrated looked like this. 3 people in mourning cloth, standing without sound in a room that had spent 1100 years governing by pretending the things it governed were abstract. She poured herself a glass of water from the carafe on the table and drank it because her throat was dry, and then she sat down. She had said what she came to say. 4 years. The Kessavari 3rd world surface temperature normalized in the 2nd year. The first seedlings were planted in the 4th month of the 3rd year. A ceremony attended by 1,200 people, which was a large gathering by the standards of a species that had 260 confirmed survivors, and was slowly building itself back from those who had been off-world when the compact came. The ceremony was not broadcast widely. The Kessavari had asked for it to be private, and it was. Admiral Rail Austin climbed the hill above the new capital on a morning in early autumn when the air was cool enough to make the climb feel deliberate. His knees ached in the second half. His hair had gone gray at the temples in the past 2 years, faster than he had expected, though he had been told by people who had known him a long time that it suited him. Vicenne met him at the hilltop. She was young, he had not expected that, though he should have. She had been a junior diplomat when the compact came. She was older now in the way that certain events make people older, not aged but inhabited. She carried the mourning cloth no longer. She was dressed in something he did not have a name for, a garment in the Kessavari palette, the deep amber and gray of formal occasion. She said, "I have a question for you, if you will hear it." He said, "I will." She said, "Has humanity forgiven itself yet, for what it had to become?" He was quiet for a moment. The city below them was low-roofed and light-colored, the rebuilding visible if you knew what to look for, the new stone a slightly different shade than the old, the spacing of new streets slightly wider, accommodating a population that was still, tentatively, learning to plan for more of itself than currently existed. He said, "No, and I hope we never do." She looked at him. He said, "The forgiveness is not the point. The point is that we carry it. The weight of what we chose and what it cost is not something to put down, it's the thing that makes us careful. If we forgive ourselves, we might someday mistake capability for permission again. I would rather spend the rest of my life uncomfortable than risk that." Vicenne said, "My grandmother was teaching school in the city when they came. She taught the children the old songs, the ones for the end of growing season. She believed, she told me this when I was 12, that the most important thing a person could do was be present. Not safe, not protected. Present." She paused, she looked at the city below them. She said, "She would have wanted to meet you." The compass arrived in the mail 2 weeks after Vane retired to her holding in the north of Iceland. The package was small, wrapped in plain paper with a note in Vane's handwriting. The handwriting was even, she had always written evenly, as though the act of forming letters required the same quality of attention as everything else. The note said, "You know where north is now, you don't need this anymore, but I thought you should have it anyway." Austin put it on the corner of his desk, next to a photograph of his son at age 9 standing in front of a landscape painting at a museum. The boy had grown, in the intervening years, into someone who asked difficult questions and accepted imperfect answers with a patience that Austin could not explain and chose to be grateful for. He did not carry the compass, he did not need to carry it, he knew where it was. He went back down the hill with Vicenne and they walked into the square where the wall of remembering stood, pale stone, both faces carved, Kessavari names on one side and the names of the human pilots on the other. The largest single piece of carving any Kessavari mason had undertaken since before the compact came. The wall caught the afternoon light at an angle that made the carved letters glow. A woman he did not know pressed a bowl of warm soup into his hands without asking. He looked up. She was Kessavari, amber-eyed, a generation younger than Vicenne, watching him with the patient attention of someone who had decided he needed to eat and that his opinion on the matter was secondary. He thanked her, she nodded and turned back to the group she had been standing with. Vicenne was already across the square, standing with a human girl about her own age, both of them bent over a tablet and laughing about something he could not see. The laughing was loud and unself-conscious, the kind of laughter that happens between people who have decided to be friends and are discovering what they have in common. The 2 moons rose above the wall of remembering as the afternoon went. Their light came down at different angles, one slightly larger, one with a blue tint from the reflected sunlight of a star that was the wrong color for Earth but was, Austin had decided over 4 years of visits, exactly the right color for here. The names glowed on both sides of the wall. He ate his soup and did not speak, because there was nothing to say that the square was not already saying, and the square was saying it well.